Hello, my name is Bridget McDonald, and my presentation is on the Attawapiskat suicide crisis. Attawapiskat suicide crisis. To start off, I'm going to give you some background information on the Attawapiskat suicide crisis. Attawapiskat is a First Nation community located in northern Ontario with a population of 2,000 people. Since the fall of 2016, there has been more than 100 suicide attempts in the community. In April of 2016, the community declared a state of emergency after 11 people attempted suicide. Fast forward to 2 years after the state of emergency, the community still lacks mental health resources and a promised youth recreation center from the federal government. The picture to the right of the screen is Shirley Gagnon, a member of the First Nation community who confessed that necessary mental health services do not exist in Attawapiskat. Introduction. The suicide crisis is deeply rooted in the historical context of colonialism, specifically the poverty created by the Indian Act and the legacy of the St. Anne's Indian Residential School, located 114 kilometers south of Attawapiskat. I would like to draw your attention to the bottom right of the screen, which illustrates the St. Anne's Residential School in the 1940s. The impact of the Indian Act. The Indian Act has a major impact on the suicide crisis in Attawapiskat. Specifically, the Indian Act created residential schools, and their trauma has contributed to the alarmingly high suicide rates seen in many Indigenous communities. The Indian Act also created the poverty in the Attawapiskat community, as the federal government controls most aspects of Aboriginal life, including economic development. Poverty is one of the leading causes of the Attawapiskat suicide crisis, as stated by Ontario Regional Chief Isadore Day, who is pictured to the right of the screen. The poverty in Attawapiskat led to the overcrowding and substandard living conditions in the community, as well as the hunger, drugs, and violence, which are all predisposing factors to youth suicide. The impact of residential schools. Residential schools also had a substantial impact on the suicide crisis in Attawapiskat. Specifically, the 2012 Aboriginal Peoples Survey and the 2012 Canadian Community Health Survey found a strong connection between residential schools and suicidal thoughts. These residential schools traumatized thousands of Aboriginal children either directly through abuse, cultural deprivation, and isolation, or indirectly through intergenerational trauma. Pictured in the top right is Aboriginal children in a residential school in Fort Resolution in the late 19th century. At the bottom right of the screen, there is a picture illustrating Aboriginal girls in St. Anne's Dormitory in 1967. The solution. The community of Attawapiskat claim that they ultimately need the right to self-government in order to put an end to the suicide crisis in Attawapiskat. The Constitution Act 1982. The inherent right to self-government is recognized as an existing Aboriginal right under Section 35 of the Constitution Act 1982. However, the right to self-government is not a court-sanctioned right. Self-government. Under the 1995 Inherent Right Policy, the Attawapiskat First Nation can negotiate self-government with the federal government. Attawapiskat can negotiate on subjects such as health, social services, and housing. In addition, Article 3 and 4 in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP, states that Indigenous people have the right to self-determination and right to autonomy or self-government. Most importantly, recognizing the Indigenous right to self-government is a crucial step towards reconciliation. In fact, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action recognizes that actions such as adhering to the UNDRIP and recognizing Indigenous legal orders are necessary to facilitate reconciliation. Thus, negotiating self-government will not only help end the suicide crisis, but will also help restore the relationship between Attawapiskat and the federal government. Legal issues. There are two legal issues that have an impact on the Attawapiskat suicide crisis, which are the development of the De Beers mine and the lack of resources in the community. De Beers Diamond Mine. The Impact Benefit Agreement, or IBA, with De Beers Diamond Mine contributes to the poverty in Attawapiskat. Attawapiskat's IBA results in the community receiving $2 million a year with preferential access to jobs and training. However, The IBA is flawed because the bargaining power was unbalanced, as Attawapiskat doesn't have people with the educational requirements to understand the IBA. In addition, the IBA offered very little to the community, as the mine's annual revenue is around $400 million, and the unemployment rate is still alarmingly high. Pictured to the right of the screen is a blockade Attawapiskat set up on the ice road to protest against the IBA. The Indian Act also contributes to the poverty in Attawapiskat, as 80% of the mine's revenue is controlled by the federal government, and that revenue is often reallocated outside of the community. Solution to De Beers Mine. As a solution to De Beers Mine, Attawapiskat can negotiate a new impact and benefit agreement with the mine. Attawapiskat would like the new IBA to include infrastructure. Attawapiskat can also push for resource revenue sharing in order to share the economic benefits of the mining operation. In addition, Attawapiskat can pursue alternatives to the Indian Act, such as the Reserve Land and Environmental Management Program, which allows First Nations increased responsibility over their reserve land, resources, and environment, or First Nations Land Management Act, which allows First Nations to develop a land code with the community. And once that code is adopted, the Minister of Indigenous Affairs and Northern Development is no longer involved in managing the First Nations land. Solutions continued. Another option to consider is a comprehensive land claim agreement with a provision related to self-government. This would allow the First Nation to gain ownership of the land, access to resource development opportunities, and to participate in land and resource management decisions. Lack of resources. The Attawapiskat community also lacks many resources such as infrastructure, housing, education, and mental health resources. I would like to draw your attention to another crisis in Attawapiskat, the housing crisis, which Attawapiskat declared in 2011. To put things into perspective, there are approximately 7 people per household in Attawapiskat. The lack of resources in a community has a major impact on the mental health of their youth, and Attawapiskat has been a devastating example of this. Treaty 9. The lack of resources in the Attawapiskat community can be linked to Treaty 9. Attawapiskat signed Treaty 9 in 1930. Treaty 9 essentially surrendered Indigenous land and resources to the federal government in order to open up Northern Ontario for settlement. However, the treaty was misunderstood by First Nations, as the community believed that it was an agreement to share the land and resources. Treaty 9 has since been found to be flawed because the treaty was written in English, which is a language the First Nations did not understand, lawyers were not present at the time, and oral promises were not included in the written treaty. Thus, Treaty 9 has for centuries allowed the exploitation of resources by the government and non-Indigenous industries, while Indigenous people face third world living conditions. Treaty rights. The lack of resources in the Attawapiskat community can be linked to broken treaty rights. A treaty right broken includes Treaty 9, which includes provisions to education. Treaty 9 states that the Majesty agrees to pay salaries of teachers and also to provide school buildings and educational equipment. However, from 2000 to 2014, Attawapiskat children went to school in portables. I would like to draw your attention to the picture on the right, which illustrates Attawapiskat children holding a sign that says, "We've never seen a real school. If the government has its way, we never will." The right to improvement of Indigenous health and education is recognized in Article 21 of the UNDRIP. As a response, Attawapiskat can argue that Aboriginal and treaty rights are protected under Section 35 of the Constitution Act. In addition, Attawapiskat can negotiate land claims and resource development with the federal government to improve resources within the community. Conclusion. That concludes my presentation for today. Please add your comments below in the discussion forum.